I told you that I was charmed with her in most particulars. Her complexion was rich and brilliant. Her features were small and beautifully formed, her eyes large, dark, and lustrous. Her hair was quite wonderful. I never saw hair so magnificently thick and long when it was down about her shoulders. I have often placed my hands under it, and laughed with wonder at its weight. It was exquisitely fine and soft, and in color a very rich dark brown, with something of gold. I loved to let it down, tumbling with its own weight as, in her room, she lay back in her chair, talking in her sweet low voice. I used to fold and braid it, and spread it out and play with it. Heavens, if I had but known all. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the St. Boulazar Ghouliversity English Club Poltercast, where we give actionable feedback to the internet's most cursed novels. My name is Jay, and this evening I have a devilish little treat for you all. See, rather than talking about a book that is outright bad, tonight we're going to be discussing one that I actually adore. It's a niche classic that, nonetheless, is haunted by some notable flaws. That's right, we are going to be sinking our teeth into one of the original vampire novels, the book that inspired Dracula and is somehow even gayer, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, a gothic doomed Yuri experience, Princesses of Austria, Volume 1. Now, as I said, I absolutely love this book. I've read it several times over the last couple of months, which is something that I do pretty rarely for fiction, and even though it's only about 100 pages long, I found it to be incredibly thought-provoking. It got me thinking about what makes for good world building, what makes for good queer representation, compelling cases for the existence of the supernatural, and even how the form of the novel itself has changed over the last 100-ish years. As many of you are probably starting to pick up on, a book like this doesn't really fit so well into our usual format, so instead, here is how we're going to break this down. We are going to take a super deep dive into the actual contents, so we're going to do an in-depth summary to kick things off, which I hope you'll stick around for, even if you've already read the book. Then, instead of jumping into a section where we talk about, the positives, we're going to analyze, casually, this book's theme. Because it is a piece of literature, after all, right? And what literature aims to do is have themes, and this book does. So it makes sense to talk about them, as positives, right? As this book doing the thing that it set out to do. And finally, we will discuss this book's shortcomings and how I think some of them could be addressed. Ultimately, my goal is to make this video as accessible and as challenging as the book itself is. Because, really, the book is super readable. For all of its thematic complexity, at just 100 pages, it is very followable. And it's great, so I hope you'll check it out. So, mix yourself a Bloody Mary, curl up in your coffin, and allow me to transport you to the ancient and storied land of Steiermark, Österreich. In Styria, we, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a castle, or schloss. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. 800 or 900 a year does wonders. Scantily enough hours would have answered among wealthy people at home. My father is English, and I bear an English name, although I never saw England. But here, in this lonely and primitive place, where everything is so marvelously cheap, I don't really see how ever so much more money would at all materially add to our comforts, or even our luxuries. I have said that this was a very lonely place. Judge whether I say truth. Looking from the hall door towards the road, the forest in which our castle stands extends 15 miles to the right and 12 to the left. The nearest inhabited village is about 7 of your English miles to the left. The nearest inhabited schloss of any historic associations is that of old General Speildorf, nearly 20 miles away to the right. I've said the nearest inhabited village because there is, only 3 miles westward, that is to say, in the direction of General Speildorf Schloss, a ruined village, with its quaint little church, now roofless, in the aisle of which are the mouldering tombs of the proud family of Karnstein, now extinct, who once owned the equally desolate chateau in which, in the thick of the forest, overlooks the silent ruins of the town. Before I started reading this book, I genuinely had no idea it took place in Austria, much less a part of Austria that I have actually been to. So we'll come back to that later, but in the meantime, I just couldn't resist mentioning it. It's too much of a strange coincidence. Broadly speaking, though, this book is, like I said, not terribly complicated. Our protagonist, the teenage Laura, and her father live a lonely life in a little castle in Styria, Austria. One day, a carriage crashes outside their home, and they permit its occupant, who is a young-seeming woman named Carmilla, to stay with them while she recovers. Carmilla and Laura begin a sexually and romantically charged relationship, during which Laura grows sicker and sicker until eventually Carmilla's identity as a vampire is uncovered, an angry mob kills her, and Laura's life moves on. But there is a lot going on underneath the surface of this grave or whatever. So, as we do on the podcast, I'm going to begin with an in-depth summary of the novel. We kick things off, interestingly, with a prologue that's narrated by this unnamed character finding the story we know as Carmilla in the form of a letter addressed to one Dr. Hesselius. Dr. Hesselius is implied to be dead, and Laura, who is the author of the letter addressed to him, is explicitly dead. So technically what we're operating with here is like a frame story. Now, you can immediately forget all of that, as well as the person implied to be reading the frame story and sharing it with us, because none of that ever matters again. Moving into the actual beginning, Chapter 1, we are introduced to our protagonist, the 19-year-old Laura, who lives in a castle in the Austrian state of Styria with her father, as well as a private tutor named Mademoiselle de la Fontaine, her nurse, Madame Perrodon, and some unnamed servants. The castle that they live in is extremely isolated. The nearest inhabited village is miles off near the castle of their friend, General Speildorf, and his daughter. There is an abandoned castle and village much closer, which was once the property of the enigmatic Karnstein family, and we'll come back to them later. In the meantime, I want to talk about Laura's relative level of wealth, because it's going to be important when we talk about themes. So, Laura might sound wealthy, and she is, but she's really careful to articulate in the opening pages that in this part of the world, where life is inexpensive, they are able to have the luxuries that they have with a relatively low level of income. She also points out that there is sort of a upper cap on the amount of luxury that they're able to have because they are so isolated. There's just certain things that they can't get. She doesn't really elaborate on what those things are, but she wants you to perceive her in a certain way that's worth keeping in mind. In any case, before the story properly kicks off, Laura recounts a dream to us that she had back when she was a little kid. So in the dream, she thought she saw a young woman kneeling beside her bed with her hands creepily under the blanket. She then got into the bed with Laura and then bit her on the chest. And Laura describes it as feeling like 2 needles going in right here. She screams, the woman vanishes, and her nurses enter the room, at which point, or sometime in that point, she woke up. So the line between dream and waking there is intentionally blurry. Interestingly, the nurses are able to confirm that there actually for sure was someone in the room with Laura. They notice an impression on the mattress next to her. They call a priest, they call a doctor, and in Laura's childhood perception, that is the end of the issue. Nothing comes of it, and Laura kind of forgets about it for a while. Back in the present, Laura and her dad have been looking forward to a visit from General Speildorf and his daughter, but not too long before the two are supposed to show up, they actually get a very concerning letter from the general, frantically stating that he's not going to be able to make it because his daughter has died, and he now intends to go on a hunt for some kind of monster. Laura is really bummed about this because she doesn't have any other friends that she names anyway, but this problem quickly resolves itself when, while she and her dad are out walking around the grounds and trying to figure out what they're going to do with the next couple of weeks, a carriage crashes into a nearby tree. 2 women get out of the carriage, one young and one old. The younger one appears to be injured, though not too seriously, thankfully. The older woman claims to be the younger woman's mother and informs Laura and her father that she is on a super urgent errand and cannot wait for her daughter to recover before she gets back on the road. Laura and her father very quickly agree to care for this younger woman, Carmilla, until her mother is able to come back and get her in a couple of weeks to months. Now, as it turns out, there was actually a third woman in the carriage with them, one Laura didn't see, but that Madame Perrodon, who was also with them, did. Carmilla identifies this woman as Matzka, which in various Eastern European languages can mean cat. We'll come back to this later as well, but in the meantime, I have to inform you that Madame Perrodon describes this woman as, and I quote here, a hideous black woman with a sort of colored turban on her head, who was gazing all the time from the carriage window, nodding and grinning derisively towards the ladies, with gleaming eyes and large white eyeballs, her teeth set as if in fury. Matzka isn't going to come back explicitly for the rest of the novel, but trust that we are going to talk about her a lot later on, so it's worth keeping this really horrible description in mind. In any case, the group brings Carmilla inside, they set her up in one of the guest rooms, and she makes a big stink about not wanting to have an attendant to watch over her whenever she is resting. She also likes to keep the doors locked from the inside, so basically when she's resting, she wants to be left totally alone. Sexual tension between Laura and Carmilla almost immediately begins to build. Laura states from the outset how drawn she is to Carmilla's beauty and to her touch, and yet how she's simultaneously repelled by Carmilla's inconsistent moods. That isn't the only odd thing about Carmilla, though, because Laura actually recognizes her from the dream that she had as a kid, and even weirder than that, Carmilla claims to recognize Laura from a dream that she had when she was a kid, where the roles were, sort of reversed. So Laura and Carmilla start spending all this time together, and Laura recounts for us that Carmilla will go through these moods where 1 minute she'll be doting and borderline clingy, and then the next she'll be all sullen and distant. From an outsider's perspective, it's pretty clear that the kind of manipulation tactic Carmilla is doing is one that would be really effective on somebody like Laura. She's playing hot and cold, which has a proven track record of being effective against people who are, isolated, lonely, inexperienced, naive, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do. It gets Laura emotionally hooked. During this phase of the relationship, which takes up a pretty substantial chapter of the novel, a couple of notable incidents happen. So, for one, while the ladies are out walking on the edge of the castle grounds one day, they happen upon a funeral procession that is passing through. The procession is singing hymns as they do, and the hymns seem to have this really visceral, really physical effect on Carmilla. It starts off by making her really irritable, and it escalates to the point where she actually starts writhing in place, and she lets out this sort of muffled scream, and she talks about how much she hates hymns and church and Christianity and stuff. Later, the castle is visited by a traveling snake oil salesman who offers the pair a couple of charms against vampires, which he says have been preying on young women in the nearest village. This is sort of consistent with other background details that we've been picking up on throughout this section of the novel. We've been hearing more and more frequently that young women in that village, 20 miles away, have been getting sick and dying. But then this snake oil salesman is like, oh no, it's totally vampires, you guys. And most of the characters are like, yeah, dude, whatever. Just sell us your snake oil and be on your way. So news of this alleged vampire also eventually reaches Laura's dad through other means that don't really matter. And he is like the novel's biggest skeptic. So he calls the belief in vampires superstitious and irrational. He attributes what's happening to the peasants to them making themselves sick with their own fear and just dying of shit that they're making up, basically. And Carmilla actually feeds into Laura's dad's scientific explanations by agreeing with him that the peasants are totally superstitious and dumb, you guys, and we shouldn't listen to them because they're rooted in these medieval traditions that we've outgrown in the advanced year of 1870. Sounds very silly to us, but I think contextually it would have been convincing enough. A few days later, the castle receives yet another visitor. This time, it is a delivery from Graz, which is the capital of Styria. It's some, portraits that Laura's father had sent into the city to be restored, and now somebody has brought them back all fixed up. One of the portraits that the delivery boy brings back is of the Countess Mircalla, who was the Countess of Karnstein. So if you remember, that is the ruined castle and village that's just a few miles away from where Laura lives. Even more shocking, though, is that the portrait is an exact likeness of Carmilla, although for some reason only Laura is able to clock this, and when she tries to point it out to other people, everybody else is like, okay, Laura, whatever you say. And it's that night that things take kind of a bad turn for Laura. She is visited in the dark by this shadowy cat-like creature that leaps onto her bed and bites her in the chest, in the same place that she remembers being bitten in a dream as a kid. The next morning, she wakes up feeling sick, and she knows right away that she has, caught whatever it is that all the peasants in the village caught, though she tries to deny it to herself, and she will hide it from all other characters for as long as she possibly can. At this point, Carmilla kind of ramps up her manipulation as well. She starts vacillating between sweetness and distance really crazily, and Laura starts getting steadily sicker all the while. This part of the novel is very tense and very enjoyable to read, but it doesn't translate super well into summary, so just know that this is a pattern that's happening. Eventually, a doctor is called, and after taking a look at Laura, he pulls her father aside and has this very intense, very private conversation that Laura isn't allowed to participate in, which is really fucked up. And then he leaves, and Laura's father refuses to tell her anything, which totally sucks. And instead, he announces that the family is going to go on a picnic at the ruined Karnstein castle, which is okay, sounds great, I guess. Laura and her father go on ahead, and Madame Perrodon and Carmilla are going to follow them in a later carriage. So Laura and her father go on their way, and their carriage intercepts, all of a sudden, the carriage of General Speildorf, who, after months, has finally decided to show up, and he just happens to catch them as they are leaving. I'll say it now because it would be kind of boring to bring it up later in the critiques, but this turn of events reads as convenient as it sounds when I summarize it. And on top of that, this scene where General Speildorf shows up is so rushed. Literally, it takes 3 sentences for this character that we have been kind of anticipating for the whole book to show up, get in their carriage, and for the story to immediately move on. It's just whoa, let's slow down for a second. But in any case, the 3 of them have a ways to go to Karnstein. I mean, it's only 3 miles, but 3 miles by carriage through the mountains is kind of a long time. So General Speildorf decides he's going to take the opportunity to fill Laura and her dad in on what he's been up to for the last couple of months, how that whole crazed monster hunt thing he's been doing has been going. Here is his story. So, months and months ago, General Speildorf and his daughter were at this, mega fancy party hosted by this other rich guy. They were approached while at the party by a woman and her daughter. The woman claimed to be an old and dear friend of the general's, although he didn't remember her at all, and she refused to actually identify herself. She promised she would do it later, but first she had a whole bunch of stuff she needed to do, and it wouldn't make any sense, she said, if she did it right away. So, using this supposed connection that they have, she convinces the general to let her daughter, and I laughed aloud at this, seriously, whose name is Milarka, to stay with him for a few months while she goes and completes a unspecified but extremely urgent errand. The general, seeing that Milarka and his daughter are already getting on, exceptionally well, agrees despite his sort of nervousness and takes Carmilla home. It isn't long, lo and behold, before his daughter starts getting really sick. Unlike Laura's dad, though, the general is somewhat more superstitious, and so he has an idea of what might be going on. What I'm saying is that basically he clocks Milarka, not as gay, as a vampire, and he decides to wait in his daughter's room at night until Milarka comes to feed on her, and then he attacks her. So that's exactly what he does. One night, he waits for Milarka to show up, and as soon as she does, he ambushes her with a sword, but unfortunately, Milarka escapes, and his daughter dies not too long after this. So, as one does, he vows to hunt Milarka to the ends of the earth, or at least to the ends of Austria, which may not be as big as the whole world, but is definitely a pretty scenic place for a vampire hunt, so seems like an achievable goal to me. Okay, so now the group, that being General Speildorf, Laura, and her dad, arrive at the ruined Karnstein castle, where the general announces that he has plans to unearth Countess Mircalla and decapitate her so-called corpse, which is part of the traditional way in the story anyways, to kill a vampire. Laura and her dad are still in disbelief at the general's story, and kind of bizarrely have not explicitly made the connection between Carmilla, Millarca, and Mircalla. Like, they recognize the similarities between what Laura is going through and what the general's daughter went through, but it's their lack of belief in the supernatural that prevents them from realizing, like, oh, Carmilla is a vampire. While the three of them are setting up for the picnic and sort of being weirded out by the general, Carmilla and Madame Perrodon arrive in their carriage. And as soon as they get out, the general recognizes Carmilla and lunges at her with an axe. They have this really short but like distinctly anime fight, and then Carmilla disappears, which leaves them all shaken. You might be thinking that this is where the novel takes like a really extreme turn. There's a lot of stuff that's been set up that we need to reckon with. First and foremost, I would think Carmilla's relationship with Laura, and how that will change now that Laura all but knows Carmilla is a vampire and is hundreds of years old. But actually what happens is that the novel rockets towards the ending. Like, don't get me wrong, it's still very, very enjoyable to read, but it also feels insanely rushed, and I have to wonder if that is in some way a product of the fact that it was initially serialized, like, for example, many of the early Sherlock Holmes novels were. They were released in sets of chapters in literary magazines, and there might have been constraints about the maximum number of chapters or how many words Le Fanu was allowed to use when writing this. I don't really know. In any case, the novel really accelerates, and here's what happens. So, for one thing, we move out of many direct scenes and into like a higher level narration of what's happening. Still from Laura's point of view, but we're not getting much direct action. We're getting her narrating large swaths of time after the fact, which, you know, this is all being narrated after the fact, but that really becomes evident here. So, they basically call a priest and a government official, one to conduct the traditional vampire slaying rites and the other to document that it occurred according to procedure. They locate and unearth Mircalla's tomb, which is in the castle of the Karnsteins. They exhume her during the day when she's asleep. They decapitate and burn her corpse. And disappointingly, to me at least, Laura plays very little part in all of this. She observes it all, but the bureaucracy is arranged and executed, if you'll pardon the pun, by the men in the story, mainly her father, General Speildorf, and some unnamed bureaucrats, leaving Laura to simply recount what happened. In our closing chapter, Laura and her dad meet with one Baron Vaudenburg, who was also involved in killing Carmilla in the previous chapter. He is a descendant of, and try to follow me on this, a man who had a relationship with Carmilla back when she was still a human, and who witnessed her transformation into a vampire and was part of a conspiracy to make sure that her tomb would never be found, so that when he died, the knowledge of Carmilla's resting place would be secret. Okay. Yeah, this is the final chapter, and we get all of this backfilled lore. But unlike last time, where we learn General Speildorf's backstory, this time what we learn, in addition to that like weird conspiracy plot, is the actual concrete rules of vampirism in this universe. So as it turns out, General Vaudenburg, as a descendant of this vampire conspiracy guy, is something of like a vampire researcher, and having scoured all available religious and scientific texts, he has sort of compiled everything that there is to know about vampires. So here's what we know. Vampires are created when a person commits suicide under the influence of a demon. Sometime after burial, they rise again, though no one, not even the Baron, knows how it is that they are able to consistently enter and exit their own grave without disturbing the soil. In order to survive, vampires have to sleep in these graves at regular intervals, and they need to consume human blood. He also notes that there's kind of two types of vampires. There's one that's more animalistic and will quickly go from person to person in order to consume as much blood as possible, as quickly as possible. And then there's another type of vampire like Carmilla, who I guess you could say is like a bit more manipulative, a bit more antisocial. And what they will do is they will immerse themselves in a network of human relationships so that they can draw out the kill of their chosen victim. They can have a bit more fun with it, which is obviously way creepier and makes for a more interesting story, in my opinion, than the former type of vampire that's just like a crazed murderer or something. Weirdly, certain vampires are also subject to what the book calls special conditions, another phrase that to me sounds distinctly anime. I feel like you could imagine hearing a JoJo character say that about their stand or something. In Carmilla's case, the special condition was that no matter who she was pretending to be or in what time period she was living, she always had to make her name an anagram of Merkala, which was her human name. There are no other examples given of what special conditions vampires may or may not be subject to. I guess Lefanu just felt the need to justify this sort of inexplicable and like kind of silly rule where Carmilla always calls herself something else that sounds really similar. In the book's closing paragraphs, though, Laura relates to us that her father took her on a year-long trip through Italy after all this was over, but that the phantoms of Carmilla have continued to appear to her throughout her life. And it's ambiguous as to whether or not these are purely illusory or if there might be something more substantial to them. And with that, the novel is over. Under a narrow arched doorway, surmounted by one of those demonic grotesques, I saw very gladly the beautiful face and figure of Carmilla enter the shadowy chapel. I was just about to rise and speak when, with a cry, the old man by my side caught up the woodsman's hatchet and started forward. On seeing him, a brutalized change came over her features. It was an instantaneous and horrible transformation as she made a crouching step backwards. Before I could utter a scream, he struck at her with all his force, but she dived under his blow and, unscathed, caught him in her tiny grasp by the wrist. He struggled for a moment to release his arm, but his hand opened, and the axe fell to the ground, and the girl was gone. He staggered against the wall, his gray hair stood up on his head, and a moisture shone over his face, as if he were at the point of death. I decided to put this segment in the place where we normally discuss positives because, again, with a book like this, its greatest positive is that it's actually trying to engage with issues that affect the real world. And so, let's talk about how it does that. That said, this section will contain a slight blend of positives, critiques, and suggestions, especially considering that Carmilla's handling of at least one of its major themes is a little complicated, to say the least. I'll begin by taking us through what this novel has to say about the spectrum between the scientific and the supernatural, then we'll examine its treatment of queerness, and then we'll finally close out on a brief examination of how Carmilla talks about economic class. I wanted to start us off with the book's take on the scientific and the supernatural because it was definitely the theme that was standing out to me the most every single time I read through Carmilla. The way that the supernatural and the scientific worlds are constantly made to clash up against one another was so blatant for a novel that was written in the 1870s. For example, when Laura and her father visit Baron Vordenburg at the end of the book and learn about the rules of vampirism, the information that the Baron has gleaned come from a combination of scientific and theological texts with titles like Magna Posthuma and Philosophicae et Christianitae Cogitationis de Vampiris. No matter how many times I say that, I'm never going to get it right. Philosophicae et Christianae Cogitationis de Vampiris. I've never sounded more American in my entire life than I sound right now. Okay, in any case, the annotations in my copy even make explicit mention of the way that these types of fake book titles were meant to make Baron Vordenburg's research sound more legitimate. Likewise, when Laura begins falling ill, Carmilla offers a naturalistic explanation that we are meant to understand as a red herring. She tells Laura, "I used to think that evil spirits made dreams, but our doctor told me it is no such thing. Only a fever passing by, or some other malady, as they often do," he said, knocks at the door, and not being able to get in, passes on. She uses this tactic several times, in fact. Another example is during this episode that I skipped over in my summary. where Carmilla disappears for almost an entire day to feed. As readers, we know that this is what is happening. She's feeding on the young women in the nearby village, but Laura and the other inhabitants of the castle are terrified, but also because they're afraid of what would happen if Carmilla's so-called mother were to show back up while she was gone. In any case, they spend hours looking for her, and when Carmilla suddenly reappears in a room of the castle that all the other characters have already searched, Carmilla is able to convince them of a false but seemingly rational explanation. And Laura's father is the biggest sucker for this ruse. He falls for it hook, line, and sinker, saying, "I wish all mysteries were as easily and innocently explained as yours, Carmilla. And so we may congratulate ourselves on the certainty that the most natural explanation of the occurrence is one that involves no drugging, no tampering with locks, no burglars or poisoners or witches, nothing that need alarm Carmilla or anyone else for our safety." The novel repeatedly putting secular beliefs in the mouth of a villain who uses them as a manipulation tactic is clearly meant, at the very least, to express a kind of skepticism about skepticism as a worldview. What if the unexplainable, the novel seems to be implying, is the explanation? On at least one occasion, the novel nearly asks this exact question explicitly. At the beginning of General Speildorf's story, he nearly cuts himself off, saying to Laura's father, "You believe in nothing but what consists with your own prejudices and illusions. I remember when I was like you, but I have learned better. And you are right in supposing that I have not been led lightly into belief in the marvelous. For what I have experienced is marvelous, and I have been forced, by extraordinary evidence, to credit that which ran counter to all my theories." Imagine for a moment that you're living in the year 1870. You're modestly educated, and you're well aware of the Enlightenment values of rationality, empiricism, and skepticism. Imagine that those values have forced you to abandon belief in supernatural entities, all the way from gods to pixies. And then, suddenly, you encounter what you had considered supernatural and unfalsifiable, even. Kathleen Costello-Sullivan, in the introduction to my version of the novel, writes, "The increasing popularity of vampires from the mid-19th century on can be read as signaling Victorian uncertainty in the face of more scientific, less religious, and therefore less mysterious world. Vampires' supernatural characteristics offered an oasis of mystery in a sea of increasing enlightenment, and yet, uncannily, also a corresponding sense of disillusionment. In this respect, the traditional combination of a vampire's simultaneous magnetism and repulsiveness arguably parallels the mixed feelings experienced by its Victorian contemporaries who, even while reveling in their accomplishments and scientific breakthroughs, mourned the perceived loss of mystery and wonder that science and materialism were thought to bring." I have to admit I was a little bit bummed out when I first read that, because I wanted to make a really similar point, and I thought maybe I was the first one. But no, it's 2025. Everything has been said before. I don't know what I was thinking. In any case, the novel is laden with tension between the spiritual and the scientific, but crucially, I think it also contains the key to resolving those tensions. Because ultimately, I don't think the tension is even really there. I think it's totally illusory, and the novel itself demonstrates this. It's like this. If vampires are extant creatures, reliably created under specific conditions, and if they operate within the confines of describable laws, if they need to eat and to sleep, if they live and they die, then there's just nothing supernatural about them. It doesn't matter who works out the process that reliably kills them, whether it's a priest or a scientist. At that point, a cross and a stethoscope become a purely aesthetic distinction, if both are equally effective in accurately assessing, modeling, and predicting the reality of vampires. The question becomes not to which domain vampires belong, but rather what the utility of a term like supernatural even is, if creatures called supernatural really just belong to a previously undiscovered order of life. See, the problem with the supernatural as a category, and I think this is true for the real world as well, which is what makes Carmilla a novel with really interesting real-world applications, is that there is no actual set of qualities that determine whether or not something is supernatural. It is not a useful term for describing a state of being. Rather, it's sort of a catch-all for thing that exists outside the world, which is nonsense, really, because if it exists outside the world, then where is it? It serves as like a mental placeholder, providing a false certainty when a more intellectually honest response to a novel or mysterious phenomena would be to say, I just don't know what this is. I just don't know what caused this to happen. And to reserve judgment until such time as one does have an explanation. And one has to accept that that may never happen in one's lifetime. You may just have to live your life saying, I don't know, but I don't know honestly. Slapping the supernatural label on things is honestly just kind of lazy thinking, in my opinion. For my part, I think that if the Victorians felt that science ushered in an age of disillusionment and an end to beautiful mystery, then I think they were just wrong. Or at least they had adopted a reductive mindset. Being a rationally minded person doesn't mean you have to give up wonder, not at all. For example, in the novella, we're given no explanation for how Carmilla is able to emerge from her hidden tomb without disturbing its facade of plaster and stone. And we are allowed to marvel at the seeming improbability of that. But that doesn't mean there isn't an answer. It doesn't mean that that answer cannot be known. If we move the timeline of the world of Carmilla forward a century or two, into a period when generations of Baron Vordenbourgs had developed technology that had allowed them to discover how vampires are able to enter and exit their own graves with ease, we would still be allowed to marvel at their improbable ability to do so. This is where the novel becomes applicable again to our actual real world. I say that if you're able to feel awe in the face of something you don't understand, or you definitionally think you can't understand, all you're doing is limiting your ability to engage with the world as we know it. We are allowed to know a lot about a subject and still be amazed that it is the way that it is. Characters in the novel prove that they're capable of admiring that which they broadly understand even. On page 63 of my copy, Laura describes the grounds between her castle and the ruined castle of Karnstein this way. Passing the drawbridge, we turn to the right, and follow the road over the steep Gothic bridge westward to reach the deserted village and ruined castle of Karnstein. No sylvan drive can be fancied prettier. The ground breaks into gentle hills and hollows, all clothed with beautiful wood, totally destitute of the comparative formality which artificial planting and early culture and pruning impart. The irregularities of the ground often lead the road out of its course, and cause it to wind beautifully round the sides of the broken hollows and the steeper sides of the hills, among varieties of ground, almost inexhaustible. In my own life, my understanding of the techniques of contemporary poetry has made me more appreciative of not just finely patterned writing, but of art broadly. Art and writing whose sequence of intentional decisions can be tracked and parsed, so that as you are reading or engaging with it, it's almost as though you're re-experiencing the process of its creation. You are sort of inhabiting by proxy the mind of the artist, sharing their experiences again. And just because I can't explain to you, and never in my life will be able to explain to you, exactly how it works down to the most minor neurochemical reaction, doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. Doesn't mean I have to say, oh, there must be an invisible, unquantifiable entity that permits me to feel what I am feeling. The most honest thing to do is just to say, I don't know, but it's beautiful. You believe in nothing but what consists with your own prejudices and illusions. I remember when I was like you, but I have learned better. Try me, said my father. I am not such a dogmatist as you suppose. Besides which, I very well know that you generally require proof for what you believe, and am, therefore, very strongly predisposed to respect your conclusions. You are right in supposing that I have not been led lightly into a belief in the marvelous, said General Speildorf. For what I have experienced is marvelous, and I have been forced by extraordinary evidence to credit that which ran counter, diametrically, to all my theories. I have been made the dupe of a preternatural conspiracy. Okay, look, I really didn't want to go here, and still don't. But is Carmilla a homophobic novel? And I mean, I really didn't want to go here because Carmilla is a queer literary icon, and so the last thing I want to do is take a story that people feel represented by and then argue that, no, actually, the text doesn't represent them, it does not see them, and it in fact maybe even harbors a kind of disdain for them. To put my cards on the table, I want nothing more than to say, no, of course Carmilla isn't a homophobic novel, it's a queer classic for a reason, and here are some of those reasons. And for a while, that was the thrust of this section of the video. It's a really tempting route to take, because if I'm able to express the exact ways in which this novel from the 1870s is actually extremely progressive, then it makes for a very exciting meta-story where this random novel by this random guy somehow displays a miraculous understanding of sapphic love. On the other hand, if the book is homophobic, then the meta-narrative is one that is much more familiar, much more tired, and frankly kind of a drag to even talk about anymore. Oh, look, here's another classic novel by some old white guy, and for all of its strengths, it must forever bear the asterisk of homophobia, like some kind of puncture wound. So, if I'm going to argue that there are parts of Carmilla that might be homophobic, what happens in it that makes me feel that way? Well, if we look at the story sort of broadly, an older woman, much older, selects her female victim as a child, waits for her to grow up, and then preys on her vampirically. She pursues something like a romantic relationship with her victim under false pretenses, even as she continues to kill additional victims off-screen, seemingly thoughtlessly and with great frequency. Much of the horror in the novel stems from the dramatic irony of our knowing that Carmilla is at least some kind of malevolent force, even as sweet, naive Laura fails to recognize this fact. Most readers interacting with the text today probably wouldn't even bat an eye at the sapphic nature of Laura and Carmilla's relationship, but I do think we have to at least ask ourselves if the queerness was, again, in the 1800s, meant to add an additional layer of uncanniness to the relationship. After all, throughout the novel, Laura describes her attraction to Carmilla as mixed with repulsion. Are we meant to understand that this is a nod to the inherent quote-unquote wrongness of the attraction itself? And to be frank, I don't know. Yes, Carmilla fits the description of a harmful queer predator stereotype too well to be ignored, and yet, in a way that I find really difficult to name, the book doesn't actually feel homophobic to read. That might sound like a weak argument, so let me try to explain. Let's set aside Carmilla herself for a moment and try to talk solely about Laura, as much as we can anyways. While the novel does play occasional lip service to Laura's discomfort at her own attraction, in execution, the romantic moments that she shares with Carmilla are genuinely very tender. I read one example earlier, but here's another. Her looks lost nothing in the daylight. She was certainly the most beautiful creature I had ever seen, and the most unpleasant remembrance of the face presented in my early dream had lost the effect of the first unexpected recognition. She confessed that she had experienced a similar shock on seeing me, in precisely that same faint antipathy that had mingled with my admiration of her. We now laughed together over our momentary horrors. And here's another one. She kissed me silently. I am sure, Carmilla, that you have been in love, that there is, at this moment, an affair of the heart going on. I have been in love with no one and never shall, she whispered, unless it should be with you. How beautiful she looked in the moonlight. Sly and strange was the look with which she quickly hid her face in my neck and hair, with tumultuous sighs that seemed almost to sob, and pressed in mine a hand that trembled. Her soft cheek was glowing against mine. Darling, darling, she murmured, I live in you, and you would die for me. I love you so. I started from her. There's certainly a sinister element lurking behind both of these interactions, but it's difficult, for me at least, to decide how much of that is supposed to result from Carmilla being a secret vampire, and how much is supposed to result from her being queer specifically. As easy as it is to read Carmilla as the aforementioned harmful stereotype, I find it just as easy to read these scenes as sort of tragic. It's a tragedy that this young queer woman, Laura, her first romantic relationship is doomed from the start. It's tragic that she's being lied to as she struggles to understand herself in a world that is just completely hostile to who she is. And I think it's also worth noting that if it was Le Fanu's explicit intent to play the gay elements for horror, he missed a few obvious ways that he could have done so. For one thing, neither Laura's father nor General Speildorf, both of whom witnessed their daughters be seduced by Carmilla gradually, comment on this. It would have been immensely easy to work out a moment where either of them expresses some kind of wariness about what is developing between Carmilla and their respective daughters, but they never do. For another, Laura herself never renounces her queer feelings. If Le Fanu had wanted to make sure we understood that the queerness itself was scary, why did he choose never to give us a moment of quote-unquote clarity from Laura post-Carmilla in which she realizes that she was under the vampire's spell all along? Instead, Laura continues throughout her life to remember Carmilla and almost to feel her presence, a presence that, it seems, wakes a feeling that's more ambiguous than anything. But at the same time, it's easy enough to argue in the opposite direction. Maybe Laura's father and General Speildorf are meant to be read as totally oblivious to what is happening to them. Maybe that's supposed to be the scary part. And maybe Laura's hallucinating Carmilla is meant to signal to us that she has been forever altered almost molecularly by Camilla's predatory behavior. For what it's worth, the real scholars are just as divided on this issue as I am. In the essay An Irish Carmilla, Jarlath Killeen notes, it's equally possible to read Carmilla as either hysterically fearful of domestically powerful women, or as a sympathetic study of women stereotyped as dangerous by Victorian culture. Meanwhile, in Carmilla and the Politics of Indistinguishability, Renee Fox notes, Carmilla may be the primary seductress in the novel, but Le Fanu does not write Carmilla as a docile victim of Carmilla's penetrating attacks. Laura initiates the first quote-unquote adult physical contact between them. When I sit down to write a video essay, part of the unspoken contract that I see myself as making with you, the viewer, is that I won't waste your time. That I will offer you my honest and well-formed opinions so that you leave this video with more information than when you entered it. That need to be honest and need to have a conclusive opinion are here, for me, in tension with one another. Le Fanu's goals with the novel aside, I do not know whether Carmilla, the book, can fairly be read as homophobic. I think that Carmilla, the individual, bears too much of a resemblance to overly familiar homophobic stereotypes to ignore, but I also think that she isn't solely a stereotype. And I also think that Laura, as a representation of a young queer person growing up in a society that does not and will not accept her within her lifetime, is both sympathetic and convincingly real. I'd like for us to consider these facts. Laura has no close female friendships, let alone queer ones. She's never dated, period, and as far as we know, she's never even been interested in anyone prior to Carmilla. She comes from a culture that does not yet have language for what she is. Queer, gay, sapphic, lesbian, all of these words in their contemporary senses would have been completely and utterly meaningless to her. What queer person coming from a background like that wouldn't feel a little bit ambiguous about their own feelings, and perhaps even instances of revulsion like the ones that Laura mentions? Without getting too personal, there are aspects of Laura's queer awakening that echo my own, and I therefore think it is possible that, even if he intended something entirely different, Le Fanu may have accidentally stumbled into a prescient queer character arc for Laura, at least until Carmilla is killed and her characterization largely falls by the wayside to make room for closing up the narrative arc of the story. As I write and rewrite and now record and re-record and try to make this section feel like something, I continue to feel stuck. So here is where I'll leave you all. Please read Carmilla for yourselves, and then, especially if you are sapphic, let me know how the execution of Laura and Carmilla's relationship strikes you. I hate to give you homework, but as always, here at SBU we value lived experience when it comes to analyzing themes like these, and so we'd really like to hear from the people who have the most stake in them. A vista opened in the forest, and we were suddenly under the chimneys and gables of the ruined village. In a frightened dream I got down from the carriage, and in silence, for we each had abundant matter to think about, we soon mounted the ascent, and were among the spacious chambers, winding stairs, and dark corridors of the castle. "And this was once the palatial residence of the Karnsteins," said the old general at length, as from a great window he looked out across the village, and saw the wide, undulating expanse of forest. "It was a bad family, and here its blood-stained annals were written," he continued. "It is hard that they should, even after death, continue to plague the human race with their atrocious lusts." Personally, I think that one of the reasons Carmilla has such staying power as a novel is that it offers itself up to a really diverse number of readings simultaneously. We can read it as a novel about the eroding role of the supernatural after the Enlightenment, or we can read it as a novel that explores Victorian-era queerness. It all kind of hinges on what you think Carmilla herself is a metaphor for, if anything. I'd like to offer one final reading of the novel, one really relevant to 2025, in which Carmilla is a metaphor for the 1%. So let's not forget that although she may appear to be young, Carmilla is a former feudal lord. Well, okay, a lady, but you know what I mean. As the Countess of Karnstein, she siphoned wealth from an entire village for the duration of her human lifespan. And as a vampire, what did she do? Well, she ramped up that siphoning to an almost comical degree, extracting the peasantry's literal life essence so greedily that the entire village of Karnstein eventually became unlivable and had to be abandoned. Her actions directly following this are kind of a mystery, but she does eventually seduce and kill General Speildorf's daughter before ending up in the so-called care of Laura and her father. This is where that class relations stuff that I was talking about in the summary starts to matter, because we have to remember that although she lives in a castle, has a private tutor, and can afford things like custom painting restoration, the novel really wants us to understand Laura as middle class. I think you could reasonably conclude that this is just a fault of the book, that it is just wrong. Carmilla, after all, argues that Laura is middle class on the basis that her father earns only a small amount of money from his military pension annually. We also have to take into account that Laura and her father consider themselves to be British on account of their heritage. I'm not a scholar of the Victorian economy, so I can really only guess that what's happening here is that Laura and her father think of themselves as middle class based on their annual income relative to a middle class income in Britain. But I would argue that if the small amount of money that they have allows them to buy an entire castle and hire so many servants that they're not all even named, and also to, again, afford custom painting restoration, then the number of money that her father receives as income is inconsequential relative to their rather striking lifestyle. In short, I think that Laura is kind of poor-mouthing, which could enable a reading of this book as like a psycho-financial fear fantasy for rich people to scandalize themselves with by imagining themselves as being a little bit less rich. But I'm kind of getting all over the place here. So Carmilla, the vampire, takes this special glee in drawing out her extraction of Laura's life, allowing the process to take weeks, even as she, Carmilla, continues to gorge herself quickly and viciously on the many poor girls in that nearby village. Carmilla doesn't just extend Laura's suffering unnecessarily, though. She also does so under false pretenses, pretending to be similar to Laura, living in her house, enjoying her hospitality, and feigning intimate companionship. Read as a metaphor, Carmilla here represents the way that the ultra-rich will try to cast themselves as having a lot in common with the middle class, in order to ingratiate themselves in broader society. Carmilla and her accomplice pretending to be dear old friends of General Speildorf reminds me a lot of Mark Zuckerberg pretending to love grilling and hunting and cooking, just like you, median American voter. And this kind of propaganda serves a very practical purpose. For one, it tricks a lot of people into seeing the ultra-wealthy as on their side, as having similar financial motives. This helps the ultra-wealthy mobilize the middle class against the impoverished, even as they work to extract as much wealth from the middle class as possible. In the end, the clergy, the law, the middle class, and the peasantry all unite in order to execute Carmilla in a bizarre but effective ritual/bureaucratic procedure. I'm gonna really butcher this quote like they butcher Carmilla, but hang in there. The next day, the formal proceedings took place in the chapel of Karnstein. The grave of the Countess Mercala was open, and two medical men, one officially present, the other on the part of the promoter of the inquiry, attested to the marvelous fact that there was a faint but appreciable respiration. Here, then, were all the admitted signs and proofs of vampirism. The body, therefore, in accordance with ancient practice, was raised, and a sharp stake driven through the heart of the vampire. Then the head was struck off. The body and head were next placed on a pile of wood and reduced to ashes, which were thrown upon the river and borne away. My father has a copy of the report of the Imperial Commission, with the signatures of all who were present at these proceedings, attached in verification of the statement. It is from this official paper that I have summarized my account of this last shocking scene. Hopefully something that you'll pick up on, even though you may not have read the novel, is the tone difference between what I just read and many of the other quotes that I've read throughout the novel. Even the cadence and diction of this section sound so bare and weird. It's very strange, but it convincingly reads as though Laura is referencing a very sterile official document as she writes the letter to Dr. Hesselius. Anyway, the novel suggests here that it's only this unlikely union of all levels of society that can collectively defeat the vampiric ultra-wealthy, finally liberating abandoned castles the world over from their unworthy owners so that they might pass into the hands of their new heirs, middle-class foreigners from wealthier countries who rent them out as vampire Airbnbs. God bless Austria. Yeah, so if it was this reading that Le Fanu intended, it's one that he maybe didn't think all the way through, or at the very least one that is sort of self-centering and self-serving. Something that adds another layer to this reading is the fact that Le Fanu belonged to the same class that Laura and her father belonged to, whatever you want to call it. So, in effect, he wrote a novel where he, and people like him, get to be history's ultimate financial victors. After all, the novel never names any peasant characters. It refers to them as a single, faceless mass, and it kills them wantonly off-screen as a way of raising the stakes and indicating a high threat to Laura's health and well-being. This novel is not a friend of the impoverished, not really anyway. For the peasantry, Carmilla's death represents, at best, a return to the status quo, to a time when they weren't being hunted by a vampire, which I guess is good. It doesn't really represent any meaningful improvement to their material conditions. Interestingly, though, something similar could be said about Laura's situation. Killing Carmilla doesn't make her family any richer or more famous. It just staves off a threat to their stability. I guess you could say that this is a novel that argues that everyone would be better off if there weren't so many very rich people, even if the wealth of those rich people weren't to, say, be redistributed or something like that. The novel isn't really arguing that people need to be lifted out of poverty, but simply that we should have less rich people. To me, that kind of seems like missing the forest for the trees somewhat, but alright. It's hard to argue with the libidinal thrill of girl vampire Jeff Bezos being decapitated and incinerated.
"Tell me nothing about ghosts," Carmilla said. "I shan't sleep tonight if you do." "I hope there is no plague or fever coming. All this looks very like it," I continued. "The swineherd's young wife died only a week ago, and she thought something seized her by the throat as she lay in her bed, nearly strangling her. Papa says such horrible fancies do accompany some forms of fever. She was quite well the day before. She sank afterwards, and died before a week. Well, her funeral is over, I hope, and her hymn sung, and our ears shan't be tortured with that discord and jargon. It has made me nervous. Sit down here, beside me. Sit close. Hold my hand. Press it hard."
So, if we were going to improve Carmilla, how would we do it? Some of y'all might chafe at the idea of my giving critiques to a classic at all, and if that's how you feel, then fair enough. But it's always been my feeling that all literature is a human endeavor and is therefore at least a little bit flawed. I think that when we neglect to remember that, we actually do the novel and ourselves a disservice by robbing ourselves of the opportunity to learn as much from a novel's weaknesses as we often do from its strengths. I also think that the novel as a form has sort of changed since Carmilla was published, and that some of those changes have been objectively good. As objective as anything in literature can really be. But you get what I mean. I'll open things up on sort of a softball, and that is that outside these sort of generic romantic descriptions of beautiful landscapes, the novel does not capitalize at all on its Styrian setting. In case you've never been to the proud Austrian state of Styria, also known as Steiermark, I feel compelled to inform you, with words and also with undoubtedly a million stock images flashing up on the screen right now, that the landscape there is absolutely striking. For such a small geographic space, it contains a pretty impressive wealth of contrasting landscapes, including both wide, gentle alpine slopes that most Americans probably associate with Austria, and these jaw-like crags pocked with ice and cut by these very inhospitable-looking waterfalls. The version of Styria that we get in Carmilla is like a castle and some woods, which Styria does have lots and lots of. It just feels like it's selling it a little bit short, and I think that's kind of a shame. One larger weakness of the novel, though, is the way it back-to-back backfills exposition and lore in the novel's final chapters. As I mentioned during my summary, General Speildorf's story sprawls across several chapters, kicking us back into the narrative past just as the present had begun to kind of escalate. This might have worked to build suspense had his story been shorter, but instead it kind of causes the novel to drag a bit here. For me, the feeling of drag is underscored by the fact that we already know from the beginning basically how this is going to go. From the minute that Mircalla, Kilarma, Kilua, whatever her name is, shows up and tricks her way into the general's household, we know what's going to happen. And yet the story drags on for chapter after chapter. And as I've already sort of hinted at about other oddly paced parts of the novel, the information itself and the writing itself is interesting and fun to read, but there's this knowledge that on a meta level, the space is not being used as efficiently as it could be. This story, in some form or another, deserves to be included in the novel, but I ultimately think it could just benefit a lot from being abbreviated and maybe even from being less near the end. My thoughts about Baron Vordenburg's lore dump are really similar. This information is very thematically relevant and unique for its time, as we've seen, but it's included in the story in probably the most inelegant way possible, and I don't really think that we should excuse poor craft choices just because they're old or just because they allow for some exciting thematic possibilities. For me, to get full marks, a novel has to have both. It has to have thematic material, and it has to be delivered in the form of an effective story. Without one, you have an entertaining story that has nothing to say. Without the other, you have lots of things to say that are not a good story, and you need to have both. Laura is also especially passive in these final chapters to the point that the story barely feels like it's even about her at all anymore. She makes basically no meaningful decisions, and she offers fewer personalized observations than usual. She gets sort of reduced almost down to a news anchor. She directs her attention and reports from the ground, but her inner world is suddenly totally closed off to us. And it kind of sucks to go from a story so focused on this doomed Yuri to one where a bunch of old guys sit around and talk about vampires, and Laura just repeats their words to us. These related problems could be fixed in a couple of ways. For example, during General Speildorf's story, Laura could be actively commenting, whether it's through dialogue or through internal monologue, on what it is he's saying. And that would convey to the reader that she is still an active force in this story, at least mentally, if not physically. A bit more radically, I think it would be really cool if Laura stepped in to defend Carmilla when General Speildorf attacked her. Not only would this heighten the tension of the scene, it would also emphasize for us exactly how strong Laura's feelings for Carmilla are. I think that Baron Vordenburg's exposition extravaganza all but requires a pretty radical intervention to fix. I don't really think we need his character at all, to be frank, and any information which he serves as a vehicle to introduce can be given to us gradually at various points throughout the narrative. He already kind of serves as a vehicle to books, so if there are other ways to get those books and the information that they themselves contain into the story in other ways, I think that would just be better. We already have various scenes where priests and scientists show up and offer their opinions about vampires, not always to Laura, sometimes to her father, and we don't even hear what they are, but if she did hear them, whether by eavesdropping or because they let her in on the conversation or because somebody else eavesdropped and then told her, we would still get these little details bit by bit, and that would allow this vampire lore to accumulate naturally rather than being included in like a couple of back-to-back paragraphs right at the end. Alright, this is going to feel like very old booktube because I'm going to use the word plot hole, and I really hate to do that, but I kind of have to. I just don't know how better to describe what happens after Carmilla and General Speildorf have their like anime fight. In case it wasn't totally clear from the summary, right after the fight, Carmilla just disappears. She disappears so quickly that characters who are present at the fight are like, where did she go? And it makes sense, right? If you had been found out in her situation, wouldn't you run away? I mean, assuming you couldn't fight everybody off. She knows she has been found out, and yet she takes no action at all to prevent what she has to assume is coming next. Because a couple of days later, the men exhume and decapitate her sleeping body without any resistance whatsoever. And frankly, I just don't know how the novel is able to justify that to itself. Carmilla is supposed to be like this expert manipulator. Why does she not go to Laura and try to convince her father that there has been some kind of mistake or like something? Failing that, couldn't she go on the run? Like, I know she needs to return to her grave to sleep, but what would happen if she didn't? Like, we don't know. What would happen if she didn't? Would she die instantaneously? And even if that is the case, when faced with the possibility of instant death via no coffin, or the certainty of death via group of scary men, who wouldn't choose to at least try to run away? It's sort of ironic that despite being sandwiched between these two massive clumps of exposition that allegedly serve to clarify Carmilla's powers and motivations, that the narrative doesn't give us enough information to understand the actions that she's actually taking right now. To fix this, I would just suggest adding some scene, where Carmilla does something to either try to survive or explain why she's choosing to allow herself to be killed. Adding a scene, no matter what it contains, would also solve a lower order problem with this section of the novel, which is just that it reads as so rushed. This probably, again, has something to do with the serialized format and or Le Fanu writing the novel in chunks as opposed to planning it out as a single entity from beginning to end before writing. The first time I read it, I was actually thinking I had misread something or that my copy was missing pages. Like, I was sure that Carmilla was going to come back after having been allegedly killed, and that I had misunderstood something because of, like, how quickly and easily she has just disposed of, followed by Laura and her father going on an Italian vacation. But no, that is just what happens, and it's just, like, not quite there. This sequence also creates a really major missed opportunity for drama that could also add to Laura's already complex and sympathetic characterization. The fact that Laura has next to nothing to say about her own feelings on Carmilla's death is kind of tragic to me. Like, the novel doesn't even make an effort to lampshade this by having her say something cope-coded like, oh, my feelings on Carmilla's execution don't even matter, it's just what happened. Her feelings just, like, are not brought up. And as convincing as Laura's troubled queer awakening is to me, this part is almost unbelievable. This is just not how it feels to be at the end of one's first romantic relationship, and even though Laura is writing from this perspective of presumably many, many years later, the fact that she barely seems to have reflected in all this time is just really hard to believe. you wouldn't really need to rewrite the whole ending to fix this, I don't think. Laura strikes me as someone who might become more private as she ages, so maybe she makes brief occasional mentions about not wanting to say how it made her feel because it's still sensitive or something like that. The rejection of an opportunity to say more would itself reveal something about the overwhelming depth of her feeling, depended on how it was phrased. And I'd really just like to have something, because right now there's this bizarre, screaming nothing in the place where not only Laura's character arc, but the collective arc of her and Carmilla's romantic relationship should conclude. It just stops happening. And that's just such a bummer. Okay, so remember an hour ago during the summary when I told you to remember that awful racist caricature that showed up exactly one time, seemingly for no reason whatsoever? In case you need a refresher, when Carmilla's carriage first crashes outside Laura's castle, there are 3 women inside. Carmilla, of course, is one of them. Then there's the woman pretending to be her mother, whose identity and intentions and origins we never discover. And the woman who is seen only by Laura's tutor, who she describes as, a hideous black woman with a sort of colored turban, blah, 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 blah. So this is the part where we talk about what's going on there. One paper that I read offered what you could call a sort of symbolism first reading of this character, who Carmilla refers to as Matzka. That is, the argument of the paper seemed to be, if we can determine what this character is meant to symbolize, then we can determine who she is in the actual text. And this is a kind of thinking that I have occasionally encountered in academia, usually coming from literary critics who are not themselves writers. And if I can be so for real right now, it strikes me just as exactly backwards. Because how on earth can you determine what someone or something symbolizes without seeing how that thing operates in the text itself? And I get how that can be really hard to do, especially in instances like this, where the character that we're trying to analyze, again, shows up literally one time. But in this case, the novel does give us enough information to create a convincing argument for Matzka's identity without first consulting external texts. So what do we know about Matzka? Well, we know for certain that she is real. In case you were wondering if she was a hallucination, we know that she isn't, because multiple characters, including Carmilla, refer to her. So she is, at the very least, not the product of anybody's imagination. Her name is an unusual transliteration of a word that appears in several different Eastern European languages, and it can mean a couple of different things, but one of the most common meanings is cat. Even though Matzka is not how we would spell any of these foreign language words today, we can be almost certain that this is what is meant, because it is in the form of a cat that Carmilla preys on her victims. Finally, we know from the Baron's lore dump at the end of the novel that vampires are created when a person commits suicide under the influence of a dark spirit. Given all of this, I think it's extremely likely that Matzka is just the particular spirit that encouraged Carmilla to end her own life, and now probably drives her to feed on people and maybe even gives her her powers. The lore implications of this are actually really exciting to me. So in this world, vampires are then not just like a single creature, but are actually more of a symbiosis between two. One being the evil spirit and the other being the dead person. I wish that we could be a bit more certain about the extent of their interdependence. Like, for example, what happens if they're separated for too long, or can they even be separated? Does Matzka need Carmilla the same way Carmilla seems to need Matzka? On top of all this, the fact that vampires are interlinked with these evil spirits creates an interesting parallel between vampires and their spirits and vampires and the people that they prey upon. Suddenly we have this multiple layered, unhealthy, emotional, physical, maybe even spiritual interdependence, which underscores the toxicity of the entire arrangement in a way that I just find really interesting. That could potentially be feeding into homophobic stereotypes, unfortunately, but assuming that we find a way to work through that, this could ultimately, I think, be beneficial to the novel. Now that we know all this, we can ask ourselves what Matzka might represent, and why Le Fanu chose to racialize her in this way that no other character is really racialized in the novel. And to me, the answer is not really complicated, it's just very upsetting. So, In old-timey literature, the features that Le Fanu attributes to Matzka are all visual shorthands for otherness with a capital O. This individual is a woman, so not a man or the default gender. She's black, so she's not white, which is the default race. She wears a turban, so she's not European, which is the default place of origin, and she's also, therefore, likely not to be Christian, which, as we know, is the default religion. And she's ugly, which is to say not attractive, which is to say the default appearance. I think that we are just meant to understand that Matzka is not like us with a capital U. We are meant to see ourselves as one way and her as the opposite of that way. She's fundamentally dissimilar to us, and we therefore have reason to be suspicious, even fearful, of her intentions. Reading this and being aware of the ways that Matzka helps Carmilla prey on our conventionally attractive, white, sympathetic protagonist, I think you could very reasonably draw the conclusion that Le Fanu was maybe trying to play on his readers' fears of some kind of covert cultural invasion, which is a really ironic fear given what Europe, including Austria, was actually doing to a lot of the world at the time that this was written. It sucks that the novel makes that interpretation available because I like this book. I don't want it to be doing that, but I think it kind of is. To put as positive a spin on this as I possibly can, I think that the problem created by Matzka's appearance is probably like the most fixable thing in the entire universe. Le Fanu doesn't seem to want us to think about Matzka as a person at all to begin with. He doesn't want us to ask about her desires, her personality, her origins, nothing like that. So the question becomes, why even make her appear human at all? Since apparently Matzka allows Carmilla to take this cat-like form when she feeds on Laura and others, why don't we just have Matzka, be a cat? She could be seen fleeing the carriage crash site, lingering around Carmilla at various points throughout the novel, hiding in shadows in the castle, whatever. Not only would this just remove all the racism from the novel, it would create a sort of familiar for Carmilla, which I think is very camp and in line with the way that the book is enjoyed today. It would be fun and spooky, and that's good. This is a gothic novel. It wants to be fun and spooky on some level. To wrap up with something lower stakes but equally fixable, we need to do something about this whole frame story conceit. The options fall into two major categories. Either do something with it or just cut it. In case you don't even remember what I'm talking about anymore, I'm referencing the fact that this novel has an introduction where somebody is describing the fact that this novel is actually a letter written from Laura to Dr. Hesselius. We don't know who Dr. Hesselius is, and we don't know who the guy is that's attaching the note to Dr. Hesselius's letter. We could go on and on about ways to blend the frame story into the novel. For example, we could have Dr. Hesselius just be one of the doctors that already shows up throughout the story. We could suggest in the opening letter that he went on to be a lifelong friend of Laura's, and so it would make sense that having met her during this traumatic period of her life and being a doctor that she saw continuously as she aged, he would be somebody that she would write to about this whole vampire thing. But for what it's worth, I think that the option of cutting this frame story element entirely is equally viable. We don't really lose anything as far as I'm concerned if we just get right into the story. No introduction needed.
We had moved a little back and had come to another seat. Carmilla sat down. Her face underwent a change that alarmed and even terrified me for a moment. It darkened and became horribly livid. Her teeth and hands were clenched, and she frowned and compressed her lips while she stared down upon the ground at her feet and trembled all over. All her energies seemed strained to suppress a fit, and at length a low convulsive cry of suffering broke from her, and gradually the hysteria subsided. "There," she said, "that comes of strangling people with hymns."
To conclude, I just want to emphasize that despite this novel's genre categorization as gothic, it's also extremely beautiful. Earlier, I read the Sylvan Drive quote, but there's plenty of other little passages just like that. Outside Laura's home, she says, "The glade through which we had just walked lay before us. At our left, the narrow road wound away under clumps of lordly trees and was lost to sight amid the thickening forest. At the right, the same road crosses the steep and picturesque bridge, near where stands a ruined tower which once guarded that pass, and beyond the bridge an abrupt eminence rises, covered with trees, and showing in the shadows some gray, ivy-clustered rocks. I love that even in these prettier passages, which are just laden with romantic imagery, something darker is always present, always lurking. There's always a ruined building or some startling landform like these hollows that invite us to think about something hiding and waiting to jump out. There is always the possibility of threat. It never lets you feel completely safe. And I think that as a story that is both beautiful and horrifying, that is part of what makes it so effective. Well, that's about all from me tonight. I really enjoyed running club today, and I hope that after being here, you'll feel encouraged to go read Carmilla for yourselves. If you do, or if you already have, please give me your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear what other people have to say about it, what their experiences with it were. What do you think about what this novel has to say about science, the supernatural, about queer representation, about class disparity? Give me all of your thoughts, please. I love to see them. I think that's about all from me today, though, so without further ado, I've been Jay, this has been the St. Balthasar University English Club, and as always, I'll see you around campus.
The following spring, my father took me on a tour through Italy. We remained away for more than a year. It was long before the terror of recent events subsided, and to this hour the image of Carmilla returns to memory with ambiguous alternations. Sometimes the playful, languid, beautiful girl, sometimes the writhing fiend I saw in the ruined church, and often, from a reverie I've started, fancying I heard the light step of Carmilla at the drawing-room door.